Okay, preparing to live stream. We're live.
Okay. Welcome to Lit Minds. This is the first of several talks that we're going to be having. And the first one tonight is about hope and resilience in a time of chaos. Let me see here. So it's a weekly series with our wonderful counselor, Greg McDonnell, who is a local Whistlerite. It's going to be Tuesdays at 8:30 every week, online, YouTube, same place. And this is a series that's brought to you in collaboration with Luna, which is Late and Unique Nighttime Alternatives, the YC, which is the Whistler Youth Center, and the Whistler Library. This week's sponsor is Nestor's Whistler. And one thing that we wanted to let you know about is basically you have an option with a question and answer. There's two ways that you can ask questions with this series, and you can ask questions to Greg. He will answer them as best he can tonight. Number one, so on the side of the YouTube, there's the chat, the live chat. You can just go there and ask him a question, but everybody's going to know who you are. Otherwise, if you want to ask an anonymous question, you can do that. In the description of the event on this YouTube page, you'll see there's a link to Slido. Just click on that, and then you'll also notice that there's an event code, and it's Lit Minds, spelled with a capital L and then Lit Minds. So that'll get you to an anonymous Q&A section. Just put your question in there, and then Greg will get that, and then he will be able to answer that. Also, the video will be up for about 48 hours. So you'll be able to find that on the links. The link will be on either Luna or the YC or at the library, and you'll be able to get that for 48 hours. And then otherwise it evaporates, and then you'll have to tune in next Tuesday for the next session. But right now I'm going to turn it over to Greg. By the way, my name is Carolyn. I'm with the Youth Center. And now I'm going to turn it over to Greg, and he can tell you a little bit more about tonight's topic. Each week is a different topic. Okay, Greg, thanks and welcome.
All right, Carolyn, thank you so much for the introduction and for hosting us tonight. Really a big thank you to the Youth Center, to Luna, to the Whistler Public Library, and to Nestor's for having us tonight. And yeah, we're going to talk about some, I think, interesting topics around resiliency and hope in the time of chaos. And you may have heard me chit chat about this in the past or recently, really with a lens around COVID, but we've shifted the sort of the title a little bit to chaos, because COVID is just synonymous with typical, well, it sounds strange to say that actually, but typical chaotic events that we might experience in the human experience. And so yeah, we're going to talk about resiliency and hope tonight. We're going to talk about the normal anxiety and grief and loss that tends to come with chaos when it shows up. And I have a number of talking points that I'd like to sort of dive into to address a few things that I think are really pertinent as we endeavor to be resilient and adaptable to changing environments. But I really am sort of hopeful for lots of engaging anonymous commentary through Slido with all of you. So please feel free to distract me. If you have a question, please feel free to make a comment on Slido or YouTube. I think we'll be able to capture those questions as well. And I'll do my best to utilize the distraction to talk about, pertinent issues that you all are facing, but also relevant to these talking points that I'm going to talk about. I'd really like to acknowledge also that this presentation is coming to you from the unceded territory of the Squamish and Lil'wat Nations. And again, with thanks to the Youth Center, the YC, the Luna, Whistler Public Library, and Nestor's. And let's get going with some dialogue. All right, I guess I would like to start tonight's conversation about resiliency and hope with a bit of a philosophical orientation that I happen to personally believe in. Now, philosophically speaking, or philosophy rather, is closely oriented to psychology on many levels. And although they're quite different, there's some really interesting overlaps. And this particular philosophical lens I'm about to introduce to you, I think, is really important with respect to how we engage with chaos or unexpected events that happen in our life. And broadly speaking, this philosophical lens is known as Stoicism, or the work of the Stoics, as in the 300th century Stoics philosophers who did a bunch of writing on the way to approach human existence. And it's funny in this time of our lives that their writings and philosophies are really coming into reality a little bit, and into stark contrast with us with respect to what we're faced with a pandemic. And this philosophical lens, the Stoic lens, kind of really forces us to engage in some uncomfortable truths. And those uncomfortable truths are often truths that we have been living in denial of, right? And and society has kind of raised us this way, right? You're not a bad person because you're in denial of this. It's not your parents' fault because you're in denial of this stuff. It's just kind of how society has raised us. And so these uncomfortable truths, an example of these uncomfortable truths might be that, on a far side of the continuum of this example is that we die, right? No one's getting out of this sucker alive, right? And so we're kind of forced to accept that stuff. And when we're young, we're kind of in denial of all that, and we're kind of invincible, and that stuff really affects our decision making, right? Around risk taking or around how we view the world. And so when something like a pandemic comes around, it forces us, if you will, to face some of these uncomfortable truths. Other uncomfortable truths, I don't know, we age. Other uncomfortable truths, the laundry pile gets bigger and we have a bunch of laundry to do. Another uncomfortable truth, we have a crap ton of homework and we have a whole bunch of homework to do, and it's due on a certain date and we don't know when the heck it's going to be done. Another uncomfortable truth might be that, society has boundaries and rules and expectations. Maybe even your parents do too, in which case you're kind of asked to live under those expectations. And so COVID kind of asks us to force or to kind of accept some of these uncomfortable truths. Now, this is a good thing, everybody. The reason why it's a good thing is because it forces us to be what I call anti-fragile. If we're kind of in denial of some of those truths, then we're going to be kind of fragile. We're kind of victims of the things that kind of happen to us. And that's a really poor kind of mental toughness, if you will, or mental preparedness kind of lens to look at things through. So I'm really into this concept of anti-fragile, this sort of belief that we are capable of managing what life brings at us. We are capable of adapting and pivoting. That's a COVIDian word I like to say these days, this idea of the pivot. And we're capable of managing these things. And, we're kind of, this is in our DNA. We're born for this because humans have survived a lot, okay? And so if we're coming from these uncomfortable truths, if we're looking at these uncomfortable truths that we're faced with some sort of outcome dream or outcome hope, and guess what? Those outcomes and hopes frequently and often don't happen the way we want them to. So we need simply to be able to react to those things. So when outcomes don't happen the way we want them to, it's going to come with some anxieties. It's going to come with some grief and loss. That's normal. Those are your body's normal reaction to an unexpected event, or perhaps an unexpected event, but the Stoics would actually say it's not that expected, they would actually say it's not that unexpected, because in fact, unexpected stuff is actually expected. So that's actually a little strategy and takeaway you might take away from this little chat tonight. right there, because when you see something wildly chaotic right before you, you might respond by saying, wow, that was expected, right? Because, and then follow that up with a narrative of, and I can handle it, right? These are resiliency skills, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those tonight. The other piece around this philosophical lens that I approach unexpected events from is really, it's also a philosophical sort of theory around chaos, right? And chaos is a very predictable part of the human experience. Everything faces chaos, you know, even this little coffee mug here with the chips in it, you know, or the laundry pile that I have waiting to be, you know, cleaned, or maybe my hair, or me in, you know, in existence. Chaos affects everything, and chaos kind of looks like this, everybody. It's sort of like this birthing process, this rise to awesomeness, this plateau where the awesomeness is kind of enjoyed, and sometimes that plateau hangs around for a good long time, and sometimes that plateau is really brief. But what we can experience and expect on that plateau of awesomeness is a very predictable, slow decline or rapid decline, crash, burn, fiery, dramatic death, sometimes literal death because we die, and sometimes figurative death, like, I don't know, someone ate all the cookies in the house and that's a bummer, right? Or the laundry's not done, and what are we gonna do about that? But my question to you is, what follows that pattern in 100% of the occasions? And really what follows that pattern, everybody, is rebirth. Rebirth. And that is another resiliency skill. So when things don't go the way you want them to, your homework is to be a detective to search for, where's the rebirth? Where is the rebirth? Okay, so chaos follows this predictable pattern of birthing, rise to greatness, awesomeness, plateau, the awesomeness is enjoyed, very predictable, crash, burn, fiery death, which comes with anxiety, which comes with grief and loss. Those are normal human experiences, and we're going to talk about those a little bit tonight. But what that process also comes with is a rebirth, and you know, that crash, burn, fiery, you know, decline. It's not always convenient. It's rarely timely. It rarely is in keeping with your hopes and dreams and aspirations, all those outcome goals. But it's actually not that unexpected. So when it shows up, you might say to yourself, haha, that was expected. Now, where's the rebirth? And that's what resiliency is all about. When I was working with a bunch of young adults in the not too distant past, I asked them to tell me what they thought resiliency meant. And one of them said it had a definition which really stuck with me. And the definition was the ability to get up when you've been knocked down. I'll never forget that definition. Such a great definition. And that's precisely what resiliency is. And it's in our DNA. It's in our bones. We are born for getting up after we've been knocked down. And that doesn't mean being knocked down is weakness. That doesn't mean having some depression or anxiety or grief and loss that comes from being knocked down. Again, those are your body's normal reactions to an unexpected event, okay? In fact, allowing yourself and giving yourself permission to stay down, perhaps, for a little bit of time, to honor those feelings of grief and loss is okay. But I'm having to manage the chat here a little bit, so just give me a second. So yeah, it's the ability to honor the feelings that come with, you know, the anxiety or the depression or the grief and loss from you know, being knocked over, and because that's your body's normal response to stuff. But resiliency is the act of getting up. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight, you know, as it connects to grief and loss, actually, because a very expected component of grief and loss is actually life enhancement, life improvement, despite the loss that we've experienced. Okay. So those are that's a little bit of a backgrounder that I just wanted y'all to have around this philosophical lens that I tend to approach chaotic events from personally. I've been really influenced by that on a personal level based on research. And there's a number of amazing books out there um, about resiliency and about stoicism and about mental toughness, sometimes in the sports psychology realm, that I really encourage you to dig up. I don't have the magic to put a URL right here, right now, but if I could, I would, but maybe write this down or think of it. There's a terrific podcast known as The Happiness Lab. And in it, only a few weeks ago, or maybe 6 weeks ago, there was a fantastic podcast on stoicism and how stoic philosophies can really help us with this idea of resiliency. Okay, I understand through the chat here that we're having some difficulty with the Slido chat capability, so just stand by while we try to manage that a little bit on the chat side of things. Okay, in the meantime, I'm going to have a sip of water because this is live and I can't edit anything. And I'm going to get to a couple of my talking points. All right. And I've already sort of captured a couple of these talking points a little bit, or kind of introduced the idea of them a little bit. And one of these pieces, before we get into really talking about resiliency and hope, is to acknowledge the anxiety that comes from experiencing chaos. It's your body's natural response for self-protection, right? And so sometimes we need to freeze a little bit to self-protect, and that's okay. And with something like, well, what we've all had to deal with the last 8 weeks or more is the fact that with a pandemic, there's no like magical answers, right? So we've all been thrust into this sort of state of hypervigilance while we try to get a grip and understand what the health authorities are telling us, what our employers are telling us, how to run our families, how to teach our kids, how to be in a relationship, how to start a new relationship, how to end a relationship. With a lot of those things, there's no magical answers. And that sometimes forces the nervous system, like I say, into this state of like hypervigilance because we don't know how to self-protect. But really a big takeaway that I want you to have from tonight is the fact of the matter is you do. It's in your DNA. We are wired to self-protect. We are biologically oriented to functionally fight, to functionally flee, and to functionally freeze. Okay, it doesn't always happen with us humans the way we like it. Sometimes we get stuck in some old behavior patterns where we are go back to some habitual self-protective response. But that's part of what I guess good therapy is about, is understanding some of those historical responses and understand why you have them. Perhaps I'm less interested in that personally, and I'm more interested in new behaviors, new self-protective orientation moving forward so you can take care of yourself. Okay, the other, and where do we feel anxiety? We're going to feel anxiety in the body. It's going to land in the nervous system. And so a lot of people intellectualize their felt experience, and they get really cognitive and they're thinking it through, and that's because we've got this big powerful prefrontal neocortex. And when we're working with anxiety, we want to kind of forget about that prefrontal neocortex for a little bit, and we want to just allow the body to feel. Okay, I'm not going to get too distracted by that at the moment unless some questions come in, but but I just want you to take away that we are wired for self-protection. It's okay to go into this freeze mode for a little while you orient to what's happening and while you figure out what your priorities are. But you better quickly hurry up living, because if you get stuck in freeze for too long, what tends to happen is that you could get eaten. Of course, that's an analogy. If a deer got stuck in freeze for too long, what would happen? It would get eaten by the cougar, right? So it's going to freeze, it's going to orient with its felt experience, with its nervous system. And what it feels, by the way, is true, and it deserves to be honored and acknowledged. And I think we as humans don't do such a great job of that because we're just too stuck in that prefrontal neocortex of the brain. So we want to come out of that freeze, and we want to functionally fight to save our backside, maybe, or we want to functionally flee to save our backside, right? And depending on the circumstance, any answer is right. But that's a key piece of acknowledging this anxiety. Okay. Second kind of big talking piece that I'd like to get through is around the grief and loss that comes with chaos when it shows up. Because of course, if we've got these outcome hopes and they don't happen the way we want them to, what tends to follow is a big depressive void, actually, because the world didn't work out the way we wanted it to. Well, guess what? That's quite expected. And I like to refer to some sports psychology statistics around this. When you take a look at Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan, a couple of the best basketball players to play the sport, these are the best people to play the game of the all time, right? And guess what? They missed about 70% of the shots they took. So if the best of all time missed 70% of the shots they took, then what does that leave us mere mortals playing basketball and working and riding bikes or doing whatever it is that we're doing? Well, guess what? We're doing the best we can with what we've got. It's actually quite expected that the outcomes don't happen the way we want them to. And so when that happens, if we smile and wave at them, if we say things like, that was expected, then those are going to be resiliency skill sets that really help us adapt. Okay. So grief and loss. When we get thrust into grief and loss, actually, I'm going to just pause things here for 1 second while I try to see if I can tackle a little bit of this this Slido issue here. But I think the smart people working behind me are doing everything that they can do, so I'll just leave it there. But certainly feel free to write any questions on the YouTube channel, and we'll kind of try to vet through them there. Okay, so getting back to grief and loss here. So again, grief and loss, it was, oh, there's a question. So why don't I jump in with just addressing this question here before I jump into grief and loss. Around boundaries. Fantastic. Okay, it'd be interesting in your thoughts, in getting your thoughts on setting boundaries, okay, with parents, teachers, coworkers, while we're all stuck at home. Great question. So before I get to the grief and loss, let's jump in with one of these questions and talk about boundaries. Now, first of all, really important to note how important boundaries are. There's a place where I end and you begin. And I think I work with a lot of people, and I say this very compassionately of them, but they have very poor boundaries. And so there's an enmeshment, or there's a codependence, or there's wishy-washy boundaries that don't respect your own needs, okay? And so with questions around boundaries, I want you to begin to start to orient with what your needs are, okay? And so if you have needs around your parents, or if you have needs from your teachers or your coworkers, you have to be aware of what those needs are. I think a lot of time people are not aware of what their needs are. And so they're just kind of like pinballing or bouncing through their environment, their school, their work, and with no awareness of those needs. And so they're kind of unconsciously or unwittingly, if you will, getting kind of walked on. And so my sort of hope for you is that you raise your level of awareness of what those needs are. Because if you have a level of awareness of what those needs are, you're going to be able to articulate them to get those needs met. Okay. And those are things you're going to feel in your body. When your needs aren't met, you're going to feel them in your body. You're going to feel constriction in your chest. You're going to feel tightness in your throat. You're going to feel butterflies in your stomach. You're going to feel red, blotchy skin around your neck or your face. You're going to feel your temperature goes up and your ears get hot. Those are themes of things you might feel in your nervous system. That's basically your body waving a giant red flag. Greg, time to do something about the way you feel. Don't ignore it. Too often we ignore that. Next thing you know, we're and times that by 100, because it goes on for weeks and months of our needs not getting met. And now we're at this cumulative stress level and we're going to pop, right? Throw COVID and a pandemic on top of that. And we're all stuck at home. We can't see our people. We got to deal with our parents. That's rough. It's really not an easy thing to deal with. So, and keep in mind, with all that stuff coming at you, it creates a charge in your nervous system. Having boundaries and getting your needs met is a way of discharging that charge healthfully, okay? If you don't discharge that charge healthfully, then what happens is your body's gonna do it for you, and that's when shit gets dysfunctional, okay? And that's when we numb our pain with drugs and alcohol. That's when we're a sack of potatoes on the couch watching episode after episode after episode of Netflix, and they just feed it to you. Eh? That little bar comes up that says next episode starts in like 3 seconds, 2, 1. I mean, and you're just like bated breath. Feed it to me, man. And so we numb our pain and we dull it out, and we do it with food, and we do it with drugs and alcohol, and we do it with athletics maybe sometimes, and we do it in all kinds of ways. Okay, so once we have an idea of recognizing what our needs are, that's when we need to find our voice and make requests to get your needs met. And that needs to be done in a functional way. And this is functional fight. Making requests to get your needs met is functional. Hey, teacher person, I'm behind on 3 assignments. Would you be cool if, or would you be willing for me to hand them in 3 weeks late? Right? Any sensible adult, teachers, I hope you're watching too, be sensible. If you hear a kid approach you with a question like that, meet their needs. Parents, if you're watching, if you hear your kids trying their backsides off to have a functional adult conversation with you and make a request to get their needs met, do your best to meet their needs, right? Humans actually want to meet each other's needs. We're kind of tribal in nature, and we kind of actually want to meet each other's needs, okay? So we're wired for connection that way. So your learning curve there to exercise your boundaries is make requests to get your needs met. The other learning curve is for those who are getting a request like that, you want to share power with people. So do your best to meet those needs. Turn toward that request. Meet that needs to the best of your ability. Now, if the need is something wild and crazy and mom, I'm going out till 4 a.m., well, that's maybe not reasonable. And there's a negotiation process that's involved there, okay? The other thing around boundaries I'd just like to indicate is that there's a kind of 4 kind of boundaries out there. There's mental boundaries, there's physical boundaries, there's spiritual boundaries, there are emotional boundaries, and those are fairly unconscious often, and there's kind of a roving pendulum that shifts where those boundaries are all the time. One example of that in a humorous YouTube video is the one on consent, which you may have seen, and it's sort of done on the parody of having a cup of tea, right? And because consent is about boundaries, and requesting consent is about sharing power around agreeing on boundaries, right? And the humorous part of that video, they do a good job of parodying this, is that sometimes those boundaries change. At one moment, the boundary might be, yes, I'd like a cup of tea. And then unexpectedly, 15 minutes later, the boundary may shift. I actually don't want a cup of tea, and that's okay. And so, I think for those of us who want to be in functional relationships, people, when we express what our needs are, the sort of the lifelong people, or the people who have shared values with us, or people we want to keep in our closer circle of friends. Those are the ones that actually want to meet our needs and actually respect us. If they don't, then that actually should be a bit of a red flag with perhaps new boundaries that you consider with those people. Okay. All right. You know, and I only think the other thing with boundaries there with respect to being stuck at home is when your boundaries are being violated, you know, or it may not be about boundaries, it may be more about the background charge that's hanging in your nervous system because of all this cumulative stress. Being stuck at home is really hard to manage that. So find other ways to have purpose and meaning in your life, okay? And that's going to be utilizing things like Zoom or FaceTime or all the socials out there to connect with people and finding different ways and creative ways to connect. And, you know, walking on the Valley Trail here in Whistler recently and seeing some of those painted rocks with, you know, I think kids that painted on those rocks, you know, magic happens and hope and thank a nurse. Or I saw one that said, call a loved one. Like those things actually give us a ton of hope. And actually, you know, I've got more to say a little bit later, and so I'll wait for that. Okay, another question that's come in here for me, and again, I don't mind ping-ponging around with these questions because these distractions are good. They often provide the sort of the rich material that we need to talk about, or that people anonymously need to talk about. Okay, so question: I feel like my reactions to things are very extreme these days. I get sad and angry much easier. Can you suggest ways to manage this? Fantastic question. Fantastic question. I'm going to break this question down. First part of the question: I feel like my reactions to things are very extreme. So that's warning sign number one. That's your body's nervous system waving those red flags. And if it's feeling extreme, if it's feeling quick to temper, quick to anger, it's probably because you've been ignoring the charge for a good long time leading up to this. And so what are the things that give us charge, right? I'm trying to speak to my audience here. I think there's some young people watching, some youth and some young adults. And so what are some things in your lives that gives you charge in that nervous system, that creates stress in that nervous system? Okay, so being stuck at home, okay? Having your daily routine and what I call the current of life that we tend to get sucked into every day, that current's just been swept away from you. And so we don't have that current and we don't have that routine to depend on anymore. For teenagers and young adults, you guys are super wired for connection. You need each other. You are family. And so all of a sudden you have to be in quarantine or self-isolate. Those things are really hard. That's going to give your nervous system a bunch of charge. How about living in the same small little house with 3 or 4 or 5 people and you got no elbow room? That kind of stuff is going to give you a ton of charge in the nervous system. Okay? So, and again, that's normal charge. That's your body's normal reaction to some abnormal event. What else gives you a charge in the nervous system or stress? I know I had a little injury recently. I twisted my ankle really badly. And for me, moving my body and getting some exercise and connecting with my community, you know, through bikes or skis or whatever it is, that's a way for me to discharge how I feel. And so with this injury, I haven't been able to do that. And so my charge-o-meter has just been turning like this, okay? There's also this sort of inverse, okay, here's the next part of the question, okay? I get sad and angry much easier. And so a bit of psychoeducation around why that's happening, okay? There's a bit of an inverse correlation between our physiological activation when we're getting really angry and maybe our brain power. Okay, so the more angry we get on the, you know, the graph, our brain power is going down. Okay, so if you're feeling that anger and you want to, you know, earlier the better, because if you feel it earlier, you got more brain power. That's your sweet spot to kind of catch yourself and sort of say, right, time for me to do something about this. Okay, so and that's when you can actually utilize some of these strategies that I'm talking about. Um, and remember what I was saying earlier about charge. And so if we don't healthfully discharge, we're going to do it dysfunctionally, right? And so, so back to the question, can you suggest ways to manage those extremes in emotions? I would suggest strongly that you raise your level of awareness of when those activation levels are growing and find healthy ways to discharge and will acknowledge and discharge your feelings. Because if you're going to keep those bottled up and buried inside, ticking time bomb, right? Sometimes we don't have an easy platform to do this. I read this really cool online biography on Billie Eilish, and you know, I don't, you know, and the biography really spoke to me because here was like a 13-year-old, you know, basically journaling, right? She's discharging her feelings of the angsty, difficulty, relationshipy, anger, sadness, love, emotion, all that stuff. She just puked it out into her pages. That is profoundly therapeutic for us to do. I think coming to see a therapist is also pretty therapeutic. Of course, I'm going to say that I'm a talk therapist, but you know, talking about how you're feeling is a way to discharge how you're doing, right? So, and you know, I think no great music was made without maybe a chip on the shoulder or a bit of anger or a broken heart, right? Or a great novel, if you're a reader. No great novel was written without, you know, some of that charge in the author's nervous system. Okay, so you know, my suggestion to you is find ways to discharge. Maybe you're going to become the next Billie Eilish. Maybe you're going to become the next Michael Ondaatje, you know, writer, where you're going to just discharge these things out into the pages. Or maybe you're going to come see a therapist for the first time in your life, or you're going to talk to a youth worker about what's going on for you. The baseline of that is do not keep the charge locked up in you. If you do, it's going to be a bit of a ticking time bomb. Okay, another question. They're coming in now. Thank you, everybody, for relaying questions in here. Whether you're sending them or they're getting vetted from your allies. Thanks for those questions. Can you discuss some ways to release this charge? Okay, great question. So I think we've touched on some of this a little bit. I'm a big believer, and I think a lot of men are find physical ways to discharge that charge, right? Because I think that's partially been in our DNA for a millennia upon millennia, right? We were out in the plains finding the meal, right? Or something like that. So for some reason, for men, moving and riding and biking tends to be a fairly healthy way for us to do that. However, asterisks, that can be also highly dysfunctional because it could just be another numbing tool. So you got to be very aware of how you do that. You might discharge mentally, where you might have this mental download, or you might read a book about it, or you might take a course on it. You might discharge spiritually, right? By connecting with something that's bigger than you as an individual. You might discharge emotionally, right? Where you're going to have this sort of feelings dump, and maybe you gotta think about where you can do that safely, whether it's through music or baking or gardening or writing, right? And again, I said this earlier, but I think, you know, talking to your friends about this discharge, it works to a degree. They're your people, they're there for you, they got your back, but they also may not have the skills to really help you. They may be really good to help you cry in your beer or give you a ride to the airport, but they may not be good for like great therapy. So it may be that you have to reach out to people beyond your friendship group, okay? People who you can trust, people who are confidential, people who maybe you see as mentors, or people who have some values and philosophies that you aspire to. Those are kind of your peeps, Okay. Now, question number 2, I can't stop looking at my phone. Any digital detox suggestions? Great question. I think the concept of digital detox is a good one. I've always advocated for a tech diet. And it's funny because I've been historically, coaching parents and telling kids, okay, tech diet, you got to get off this stuff. Then COVID happens and then we're saying, okay, you got to get back on the tech. You got to do school on technology. You got to connect on socials with everybody. So there's this irony happening here, which is quite interesting. But there's a lot of really profound research out there that really tells us how negatively reinforcing some of the stuff we're consuming online is. Just to touch on one of those is that journey of external validation through social media. How many likes did I get? Did they respond? Did they DM me? If they did, therefore I'm worthy, right? That unconscious orientation makes us powerless. That unconscious orientation makes us victims to decide ourselves that, hey, wait a minute, we ourselves are worthy of love and belonging. As it turns out, that reality is in our hands, not in somebody else's hands. So that's the big piece around the socials that disempowers people. So yeah, tech diets. I had someone I was talking to recently talk about, that teacher, they were really choked at the teacher that was mailing or emailing them at midnight for such and such that's due tomorrow. And how could they email me at midnight? And the first thing I thought was, well, how could you have your phone pinging in the bed at midnight? So one of those digital detox suggestions is airplane mode, or certainly not taking your phones into your bedroom. Get an old $5 reuse it center or home hardware, old school clock radio, and keep your phones downstairs. Or I can't even remember what it's called, but on your phone, you can basically put it on like silent mode between certain hours. Well, do that. And don't look at it. The other thing I'd suggest is no blue screens within an hour before you go to bed. So things like sleep, I think, really require something which I call sleep hygiene. So the hour before you go to bed, you want to be doing certain behaviors that are giving the nervous system the clue, the symbol, the behaviors that tell it it's time to go to sleep, right? And that's not checking the post one last time. How many likes did I get? Did they DM me back? That's going to activate the nervous system, activate the brain, and quite frankly, stimulate more anxiety. So there's some suggestions there. Okay, I have adults in my life who aren't taking COVID restrictions seriously. How do I talk to them about this and have them take me seriously? Wow, great question. Really tough when those people around you whose job is to keep you safe maybe have a different philosophy or orientation that you have. Or maybe they're not very influenceable by you as a teenager to have your own wishes. And that's unfortunate. That's a challenge. I've always, when I work with parents, I always work with them and I have a loud voice around, kids are people and they deserve to be heard and acknowledged, and they deserve to have their needs met, and they need to be guided around that for sure. But we can't just be the authority and expect them to commit to our value system. They're going to have their own value system at some point along the way, and I like to tell parents that's a good thing. It means they're going to move out at 18 or 19 years old, right? And that's a good thing. Because they're individuating, they're becoming their own young people. And so if parents are listening, my wish, my hope for you is that you can start to sort of acknowledge your kids as people and acknowledge their needs and be influenced by them. That's the other piece is if you're going to live harmoniously with your partner or with your kids or in a family in a small house with all these restrictions, then one of the most important ingredients is the rule of influenceability, being influenced by one another. If you're influenced by one another, it greases the wheels. It makes you feel respected and heard and trusted, and that builds connection, right? And that's what parents are trying to do with their kids, is attach with them healthfully. Okay. Yeah, apart from that, individuate as kids and follow your own restrictions based on your mentors or what population health authorities are telling us and the government's telling us, right? Okay. I'm getting wrapped up in these distractions, and we have about 15 minutes left, but I do endeavor to actually, I'm not rushing off this live platform, so I'll stick around for as many questions that you have left. And I do really want to get to a couple little things with respect to grief and loss, and also around hope as well. But I also want to get to some of these questions because they're great. Should I be having mixed emotions during this time stuck at home? Absolutely, you should have mixed emotions during this time stuck at home. Your natural ways of discharging all that charge in your nervous system has been taken away from you. So you're going to have mixed emotions. You're going to be happy. You're going to be sad. You're going to be mad. You're going to be glad. It's going to shift and morph and change quite frequently. And that's your body's normal response to a bunch of abnormal events. Okay, I feel like everyone is saying that we should be super productive right now. You know, baking bread, learning how to play ukulele, doing all these work projects, gardening, you know, doing things with the parents. So everyone is saying we should be super productive, learning another language or playing guitar, all those things. But what's happening, I think, for this person asking this question is the tight constraints to the living environment are driving this person nuts. And so this is creating stuck energy, and it's zapping the energy out of the nervous system. And so you can't be productive. And so, yeah, you know, I would say, careful of the outcome orientation there. Your productivity doesn't have to look like the perfect sourdough bread of all time, right? Do the best you can with what you've got, okay? And if your boyfriend's driving you nuts because you're all stuck in a small space during this isolation, find ways to nurture your own hopes and dreams and aspirations separate from your boyfriend, but at the same time, nurture those hopes and dreams and aspirations that are shared with your boyfriend. Okay, so nurture individual hopes and dreams and aspirations and shared hopes and dreams and aspirations. So go to bed early without your boyfriend and read a book, right? Go garden without him because it's your hope and dream and aspiration or your interest to learn how to garden. You know, perhaps he wants to join you for that, but maybe you're not even okay with that because you like the alone time, and that's okay too. Speak your truth. Okay. Okay, that's the last question for now. Keep the questions coming, but I will take this opportunity to just touch on grief and loss, this grief and loss talking point. And that's, you know, when the implications of grief and loss start to emerge for us, our survival skills tend to go kaput. You know, our survival skills get thrown out the window. So our natural ability to take care of ourselves tends to be gone. And so we're not eating well, we're eating too much ice cream. This is definitely when people tend to abuse drugs and alcohol a little bit. Maybe they're overwatching Netflix, or they're consuming too much digital stuff. And so that's your body's normal response to a bunch of abnormal events. But we need to be able to come out of that mode. We need to get back our survival mechanisms back. So I think one of the things that really helps with that is having some routines, okay? Having some routines to live by. And here's a couple that I like, right? Is getting up at a specific time, going to bed at a specific time. Another one would be checking in with a loved one. Getting some exercise, moving your body. The other thing I do when I get up, this is a Gregism perhaps, but I make my bed. Someone told me once that there's this Chinese proverb that when you make your bed, it sets the intention for the day. And I love this with respect to chaos because, you know, when you look at your bed and it's messy, that's chaos, right? But if you, and it's so acknowledging that chaos is there, it's real, it's part of the human experience. But when we make our bed, it kind of sets the intention for orderliness in the rest of the day, okay? Other routines might be checking in with school, emailing your teachers, doing the exercise program that you've got to rehab that twisted ankle. Other routines are around, again, taking care of ourselves mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Okay. Once that starts to happen and we tend to kickstart, that routine helps kickstart us into some form of normalcy in our lives. And when we do that, a form of what I call life enhancement comes back. Life gets better. We learn how to take care of ourselves better because of the chaos that COVID presents, right? So, you know, as we move forward and the government releases new ways to double our bubble and triple our bubble and stuff like that, we're still gonna have to wash our hands. We're still gonna have to distance a little bit. We're still gonna have to not lick each other in the face so we don't get ill, right? And so these are life enhancing things. This is how we grow as people. And that's a funny example of how we find life enhancement, perhaps through grief and loss. But it's even there are even good examples of how we find grief, life enhancement through terrible grief, like death, right? And that's like, for instance, being influenced by the person who's left us, so that we can live the rest of our lives in a particular way that's connected to our values, right? So. With that life enhancement, I personally am really into that, okay? And I'm a real detective for those things. That's the rebirth, right? That's the okay, when's rebirth gonna happen here? And I'm really interested in finding that. And so when we tune into that, when we narrate positivity, when we tune into those things to improve our life, life gets better and life tends to go on a little bit, okay? So another question's come in, so I'll just you know, try to dive into this a little bit. I feel like things seem manageable with COVID at first, but now it seems like an infinite timeline for how long it's going to take to get back to some normal. And I'm feeling more concerned about work, money, and health. How can I put this in perspective? Great question. Well, I think the perspective is, you know, being concerned about work, money, and health is a good thing. But two things with that, with respect to work, money, and health. Number one, you don't want to have a negative narrative about all that stuff. And number two, you don't want to avoid things to do with all those stuff. If you have a negative narrative about stuff like that, and you have avoidant behavior about stuff like that, anxiety is going to go like this to 11, right? So create a positive narrative about work, money, health. And rather than avoid behaviors or adaptations or pivots around those things, turn toward them, okay? Turn toward them. The other piece is, and you can disagree with me if you want, but we're not gonna return to normal, okay? This COVID business is gonna stick with us for a long time. It's gonna stick with our bones. So the normal as we know it, or as we knew it, I don't think we're gonna return to it. It's gonna be a different normal. As you may have heard, maybe it's a famous Winston Churchill quote, but it goes something like this. blah, I can't remember it, but it's something like, it's the end of the beginning, right? So that means there's a next chapter to how we adapt to this COVID piece, right? So it's a new normal. But that doesn't mean it can't be good. Like, because by the way, the old normal, I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I think the world was kind of careening towards a cliff there. It was careening towards the cliff with the environment. It was careening towards the cliff with how we spent money and how we click a button and this wild thing is here with a bunch of carbon burning on our doorstep the next day. We're careening towards a cliff with 10,000 friends on YouTube. And so I don't think that normal can be sustained anymore. And this is one of those uncomfortable truths that kind of COVID suggests to us. And it forces us to accept this chaos. So the new normal is actually adapting to it. And again, taking away that piece around grief and loss is hurrying up and living in a way that you're safe and those around you are safe, and that you continue to have hope, right? Okay, I hope that kind of helps. Lastly here, I guess, or this next question rather, I find my moods are more erratic during COVID. Is it better to try to regulate them, or is it better to let my emotions out? Neat question. That's a really neat question. Again, I talked about this earlier, is your erratic mood is normal. It's your body's normal response to a bunch of abnormal events, okay? And so, again, inverse correlation with physiological activation. You're gonna feel that in your body when your mood gets jacked up to that rage point. The more that goes up, the more your brain power is going down. So I suppose, like, a wise person would want to contain that mood a little bit, so it's not just unwieldy and lashing out and freaking out at everyone that took your parking spot at Nestor's, right? You don't want to do that. So you want to be able to contain that mood again a little bit, and you want to be able to discharge it appropriately, okay? And here's a couple hot tips on that. Earlier is better. If you wait until you're way too activated, you got no brain power at that point, and you got no control about how that mood comes out. Now you're freaking out at the guy that stole your parking spot at Nestor's, right? So you want to be able to modulate that discharge and use it, sort of discharge it appropriately, functionally. And that might be with a good therapist. That might be with your inner circle of people who you're safe and worthy around, okay? Yes, it's better to let your emotions out. You don't want to perpetually keep them locked in. That's a big burden to carry. So we want to find a way, a healthy way, a functional way to discharge those emotions, okay? So again, great question. Is it normal to feel anxious about going back to normal again? Yes. Anxiety is your body's normal response to abnormal events. So it's normal to feel that way. Anxiety is normal. It means you're kind of human. If you didn't have anxiety, it'd mean you'd be a piece of cardboard or an alien. I say that all the time. We welcome anxiety. It's your body's normal self-protection working. But here's the trick. You got to listen to it. You can't distort events that are happening to you. In other words, create negative narratives about the stuff that you're dealing with. And you can't avoid it. If you distort the narratives around going back to normal, and if you avoid going back to normal, your anxiety is going to go up. We don't want that. And so sometimes maybe did we get too comfortable being at home? Maybe, but again, I think we're wired for connection, and we're just kind of waiting for that opportunity to connect with our people again, and to branch out into our worlds again. And I, for one, believe if that world the pace of life is slowed down a little bit and we're connecting with less people, that's probably a good thing. That's probably a healthy kind of new normal that we're probably going to step into a little bit. Okay, I want to make a couple comments as we begin to wrap up. If you got a couple more questions, please send them in. But as a wrap up, I want to talk about hope for a second. And maybe you've heard me speak recently about this, or seen me quoted in the local newspaper, or the Peak News magazine. about this. And so maybe you've heard this before, but I think it bears repeating. I think there's three things that give us hope. Okay. The first thing that gives us hope is having a set of personal values to live by. And those values might be personal values, they might be family values that you discuss with your partner or your family. But we all need a set of personal values, and some examples of those might be love, honor, approaching people with heart open, with love, having honor, having integrity, having resiliency or strength. And maybe that's emotional strength, and maybe that value is physical strength, right? Those are examples of sort of personal values that you may have. One of them I hope that you are starting to cultivate, and maybe this workshop has helped, is sort of that inner belief that you can get up after you've been knocked down, that you're resilient. I think resiliency is a value, and it's a learned muscle in our brain that we can narrate stories around and facilitate inner belief around so that we embody that value. Okay, so values give us hope. The second thing that gives us hope is having purpose and meaning in our lives. And so with young people, I'm always really curious about what's their identity. What's the identity in the background that's operating like a scaffold or a foundation holding this kid up? People who are psychologically well tend to have many things that define them. So for kids and youth, you want to broaden that. You want to have many things that define you. So I think this COVID time and playing guitar and learning ukulele and gardening and baking sourdough and all those kind of things, those are lovely ways to explore that identity and explore what gives you purpose and meaning. I had a great conversation with a mountain bike friend of mine he's got this beautiful engineering brain, and he's trying to figure out ways to work with kids in the high school around bike maintenance, and because he's trying to reach those kids that have that engineering brain too, that are curious about bikes, not because they're going to be a bike mechanic for the rest of their life, because it might open the door to some passion around fixing things or engineering. And I just think that's great. And so values give us hope, and purpose and meaning gives us hope. And if you're a young person, and if you were anything like me, I had no idea what my purpose was. And so I was a bit of I was just blowing in the wind. And so thankfully I had some mentors who gently guided me. And I had some parents who allowed me to go on a journey. And they weren't worried about what the destination was so much, because that journey is what opens your door to these things that give you purpose and meaning. And following that journey is where the destination kind of arrives, right? And so values give us hope, purpose and meaning gives us hope. And the last thing that gives us hope is community, okay? So it's connecting with your community. And that's been hard through COVID and the coronavirus, because we've had to self-isolate, we've had to quarantine, and so our community's kind of been ripped away from us a little bit. But let's find ways to do it safely, socially distant, where we can connect. And maybe that's through the socials, maybe that's through Zoom platforms or otherwise. Maybe that's through having a trivia night with your family all on a Zoom call or a FaceTime call, but find ways to connect to your family. So resiliency opportunities that I think come from finding hope are things like finding this new identity, investing in who you are next and being curious about what that is, finding new purpose and meaning, and perhaps having a slower pace of life. Some things that really give that I think attend to our self-care through this time is being outside, getting fresh air, checking in with a loved one, moving your body, being mindful and deliberate about what you're engaging in. Those are going to be some self-care tactics. So we're coming close to wrapping up, everyone. I think I'm going to try to tackle a couple last questions here that are coming in. Okay, this question: I have a lot of seniors in my life. How can I best support them during this time? Fabulous question, really caring question. I think that's a really empathetic question, because And it's not being in denial of the uncomfortable truth. It's being really aware of some of those uncomfortable truths. And one of those is that seniors are way more affected by COVID than young people are, as we know. And so you being aware of that and curious about that is a great start, because you want to care for them. So so I think the first thing that jumps to mind for me, knowing that every person has a different safety orientation to COVID. You know, for instance, for an example of that is you go to Nestor's or the grocery store where you live, and some people have masks on and gloves, some people don't. So there's an example of that roving sort of engagement with what staying safe during COVID means. And everyone's entitled to their own interpretation of that, I suppose. And thankfully, we live in a wonderful country, civil society that tends to follow the rules, you know, as you know, the health authorities and government outlines them. And that's a real testament, I think, to our country and to people like Bonnie Henry and Adrian Dix and us as British Columbians and Canadians for following those rules. But I think the bottom line is you want to check in with the senior. What's going to work with them? You know, I'll give you an example with my own mother. Is she's pretty activated about coronavirus, and that needs to be respected. And so I'll leave it up to her with how I'll engage with her through things like Mother's Day, or through things like doubling our bubble, but doing it in a way where we're still socially distant. So I think that's one way you can connect with some of those people in your life. Okay, question number 10, I think. What is my number one tip to stay connected to your consciousness? Great question. And I think my number one tip is to start to tune in to a concept known as mindfulness. Mindfulness is the deliberate act of tuning in to what's real in your nervous system right now. And I think a quick way into that world is by tuning in to your nervous system, tuning into your senses, your sense of touch, sense of taste, sense of smell, sense of hearing, and sense of sight. When you tune in to all of those things, they quickly and truthfully help you connect with what's real in the here and now, okay? Because that's how we orient to self-protect. That's how we orient to take care of ourselves. So the question continues. It seems like the hardest part is remembering to stay conscious or present when you begin to disconnect. Okay, again, that disconnection sensation, that's going to show up in the nervous system in the body more so than the brain. The brain's going to take us on some wild, distorted ride that's full of the what ifs and the if onlys and the should haves and the how could he's and the how could that teacher. And then we go on that wild ride, and then the anxiety-o-meter is just going up to 11, okay? So it's being conscious of those narratives and being the architect of creating those narratives that are adaptive for you. So being in the here and now and being mindful of your processes and your feelings, and maybe even journaling those, maybe even writing those down. And journaling sometimes hard. People don't commit to journaling very often, but what people do commit to is what I call bulleting. Write 2 or 3 or 5 bullets and just puke them out on a piece of paper and then reflect on them. And if you can make that part of your routine, when you look back at your journal, and you can reflect on how you were feeling with this specific time, that might help raise your level of consciousness as well. All right, I'd like to start to wrap up here, and I have a couple notes that I really need to remind you all of. And the first one is we are going to be doing the next Lit Minds live YouTube broadcast 1 week from tonight. That's Tuesday, May 28th, I do believe. Carolyn will give me a thumbs up if it's the 28th. I do believe it's 28th at 8:30. And so I'd like to invite you to stay tuned to all of your connective points, whether that's the book face or the Facebook or the intertubes or the chat snap, because all of the details about these events will land on those things and you'll find out about them. And so we're going to have another exciting topic that we're going to talk about next week, May 19th. Thank you very much, at 8:30. And I hope you can tune in and join us. I'd like to begin to wrap up. If there's any other notes, please send them to me by thanking the Youth Center, the YC, Luna, the Whistler Public Library, and Nesters for contributing to making this happen. And certainly, as we wrap up, I'd like to invite you all to think for a minute about who is the loved one that you're going to connect with today or tomorrow, and who is the person you're going to reach out to if you're not feeling great, and if you'd like to discharge some of those emotions that you're feeling. Who is that person? And I'd like to challenge you to reach out to them and talk to them. And if you don't have anyone, maybe you consider reaching out to your friendly neighborhood youth worker, or maybe even a registered clinical counselor such as myself, or other therapists that are out there and accessible to you. Yeah, and if you want to talk about certain subjects in this platform, please let us all know, and then we'll try to tackle them in future engagements like this. But for now, I'd like to sign off from this live event. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, listening to me ramble on in this medium for the first time that I've ever actually done a live sort of broadcast like this. So thanks to everyone for putting up with our learning curve on the tech side of this. But thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you next week, May 19th, 8:30. Good night.